honour to be here once again to talk about something that is very close to my heart. But first of all, I think in these rather turbulent days when Britain is starting to formally negotiate what I hope will be a very amicable separation from the EU, I think it's an apposite moment to pause, to remember the many deep ties that link Britain and Belgium, ties that were forged and strengthened in the mud and blood of that most terrible battle of 1917, Third Ypres, or Passchendaele. Sorry, French pronunciation, English pronunciation. But this is the moment, first of all, for me to come clean, although maybe clean is not a very good word to use in association with Third Ypres. I am not a military historian. Greater minds than mine would be able to talk with awe-inspiring knowledge and wisdom about the battle, the tactics, and the merits and the shortcomings of the High Command. What I hope to do in the next 20 minutes or so is to provide a few insights into the way that women told the story of the Great War, and indeed Belgium, through, as Guy has said, poetry. In case a few of you are a little disconcerted at the idea of women war poets, let me just give you a very intriguing statistic. There were approximately 2,000 poets who were published during the First World War, and of those, well over a quarter, so well over 500, were women, and their poetry was as widely read as the men's. Highly respected newspapers, including the Westminster Gazette, offered lucrative prizes which women frequently won. In one early 1918 competition, a subaltern in the Manchester Regiment came second, whilst first prize went to a nurse, Alberta Vicarage. Oh, by the way, just in case you're wondering, the officer who came second was called Wilfred Owen. Vicarage, like thousands of her colleagues, would have nursed casualties from Passchendaele, one more battle whose early promise of victory had been ground down in the ubiquitous Flanders mud. When the opening salvos of the Battle of Passchendaele were fired on July the 31st, 1917, British women had plenty of inside knowledge about the country that had been affectionately dubbed and was still known as gallant little Belgium. From the beginning of the war, many women had served in Belgium. Suffragist author and poet May Sinclair had arrived in Belgium in September 1914. She was caught up in the retreat from Antwerp, and when she was finally back in England, she was, and she remained, haunted for years by the human tragedy which had unfolded before her eyes. In her nightmares, she wrote, "I get up and I go, not to the cities of Flanders, not to the city of Bruges or the city of Antwerp or the city of Ghent, but somewhere in the fields, to the house with the slender door, standing low and alone in the flat Flemish land." By July 1917, even those who had never left England were audibly aware of what was going on over there. One woman highlights the contrast between her own Sussex garden and the gardens of Flanders, where nature turns faint at the thunderous crash of the conflict. Hell is let loose, war, grim and terrible, red-eyed, red-handed, stalks naked, followed by all his dread offspring of ruin and famine, madness of battle and slaughter and ruthless destruction. Hell's over yonder. Whilst this poet had only heard the guns over yonder, other British women had direct personal contact with Belgium as nurses and ambulance drivers. For many men who were wounded, the first leg of their evacuation to a hospital facility was courtesy of a very colourful group of volunteer British women, the members of the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, affectionately dubbed Fannies, who arrived in Belgium in September 1914. This unit had been formed pre-war with the optimistic idea of galloping onto the battlefield to rescue casualties and galloping back, dragging a stretcher behind them. Well, galloping on horseback soon proved a bit of a non-starter. So, ever adaptable, these upper-class women transformed themselves into mechanised or motorised ambulance drivers. They were quick to capture in poetry the contrasts between their pre-war society lives and their current quasi-military existence. One former debutante wished, "My mother could see me now, with my grease gun under my car, filling my differential ere I start for the sea afar." The conditions that the women worked in were often overwhelming, mentally and physically. Dedicated, determined and dauntless, showing superb driving skills and utter disregard for their own safety, they tell harrowing tales about driving cargoes of wounded in all weathers and across all terrains. I actually find it quite reassuring to know that these women played hard as well as worked hard. When granted precious home leave, more than one stopped off in Paris on the way to buy a naughty nightie. Their service overseas was in fact one of grim dedication. One wrote home describing one of the many ghastly nights in late October 1917 when she was driving casualties from Passchendaele. Driving her windscreenless ambulance through a hailstorm with the wind straight against us. At times, she writes, the hail was so severe that I thought my poor face was bleeding. She was agonisingly aware of one fatally wounded passenger who was conscious but dreadfully hit in the stomach, arms. I've got kind of numb at hearing people in agony, but I think one hates seeing these dreadful sights more and more. One poet, Ada Harris, wrote about the ambulance's human contents, and this struck a chord with several Fannies. They are bringing them back, who went forth so bravely, grey, ghost-like cars down the long white road, each with a cross of scarlet on canvas hood, and its heavy load of human sheaves from the crimson harvest. O Red Cross car, what a world of anguish, on noiseless wheels you bear night and day. Each one comes from the field of slaughter. A field of slaughter that many women serving on the Western Front were every bit as familiar with as the men. Another woman who saw, smelt and poeticised the dreadful realities of war service in France and Belgium was a woman who, in my, of course, unbiased opinion, is the finest of all war poets of either gender. Her name was Mary Gordon. In 1913, this Vassar graduate, daughter of a Chicago millionaire father and a Christian fundamentalist mother, was living in London, unhappily married to an Anglo-Indian missionary. A militant believer in women's suffrage, she has a direct connection to Westminster, for in the autumn of 1913, May, as she was known, was selected to fling a stone through the windows of the Whitehall Treasury buildings. She was delighted. But although to her dismay, 2 stones fell wide of the target, the third crashed spectacularly and so satisfyingly through the glass. Unsurprisingly, she was arrested. She spent 5 nights in a prison cell before, to her absolute fury, her husband paid her 25-shilling fine and she was released. When war was declared, she proclaimed her willingness to become a volunteer nurse and to serve overseas. Despite having no nursing skills and only a very basic knowledge of French, her can-do attitude was such that she felt that neither of these gaps in her CV created an insurmountable barrier, nor did the fact that she was very heavily pregnant. Nursing skills can be acquired and, as a Vassar graduate, she surely had enough grey matter to master the rudiments of French while sitting out the pregnancy. Her optimism was well placed. In January 1915, May underwent training in a grim Dunkirk hospital, where hideously wounded and mortally sick French poilus were being, and I hardly like to use the word nursed, in conditions that resembled those of the Crimea War. Distraught, she hatched a plan to develop her own unit, and she would be the directrice. In order to kick-start this idea, which she estimated would cost £4,000 to start, with ongoing monthly running costs of £200, she relinquished the lease on her Park Lane house and sold all the furniture. I don't know if her husband, who was an interpreter with the Indian Army, knew about this. She moved herself, her considerable American investments inherited from her father, and her 3 daughters to Paris, thereby relinquishing membership of the British Tax Club. A small footnote is that by the end of the war, her fortune had evaporated. In July 1915, the Mary Borden Hôpital Chirurgical Mobile Numéro 1, consisting of 12 long wooden portable huts with reinforced windows to take the strain of heavy firing, was up and running on the Dunkirk-Ypres road. As the name Mobile implies, like all casualty clearing stations, it could be and frequently was packed up and transported with only a few hours' notice. In July 1917, they were at Rosebrugge, 20 miles from Passchendaele. Overwhelmed by the never-ending stream of hideously wounded men, in her poetry, May and her patient's sufferings merge into an orgy of mental and physical anguish. Their wounds gape at me, their stumps menace me, their bandaged faces grimace at me, their death rattle curses me. I am stained, I am soiled, I am streaked with their blood, I am soaked with the odour of the oozing of their wounds. I am saturated with the poison of their poor, festering wounds. I am poisoned, I am infected. I am heavy with the weight of my helpless, wounded men. In 1916, May had witnessed and immortalised the latest advances in technological warfare, tanks. These obscene crabs, armoured toads, crushing under their bellies whatever stood in their way. But at Passchendaele, despite the hopes pinned on this oh-so-modern weapon, tanks would, in reality, fail to crush whatever stood in their way. They gave ample demonstration of ineffectiveness in boggy conditions and waterlogged trenches. The constant rain had turned the battlefield into the quagmire that we all now associate with 3rd E. Mud is, of course, synonymous with the Great War, and nowhere more so than at Passchendaele. Many of you will have heard the apocryphal question posed by a general who, visiting the battlefield in autumn 1917, wept when he beheld the terrain and, allegedly asked, "God, did we really send men to fight in this?" The story goes that his guide answered calmly, "It's worse further up, sir." Not wishing to bog myself down in any controversy surrounding this remark, whether it was ever uttered, or indeed whether the general staff were as ignorant of the realities of the battlefield as a generation of historians claimed, let us instead turn back to Borden, who so skillfully summed up all mud's horrors. This is the hymn of the mud, the obscene, the filthy, the putrid, the vast liquid grave of our armies. It has drowned our men. Its monstrous distended belly reeks with the undigested dead. Our men have gone into it, sinking slowly and struggling and slowly disappearing. Our fine men, our brave, strong, young men, our glowing, red, shouting, brawny men. Slowly, inch by inch, they have gone down into its darkness, its thickness, its silence. Slowly, irresistibly, it drew them down, sucked them down, and they were drowned in thick, bitter, heaving mud. The mute, enormous mouth of the mud has closed over them. One of the hundreds of thousands on both sides who was all too familiar with the Passchendaele mud was 29-year-old Second Lieutenant Guy Patterson Cranmer. Granted a few days' leave on the 17th of September 1917, this former schoolmaster, now serving with His Majesty's forces, obtained a special licence, allowing him to marry his sweetheart, Elsie Breed, on the 23rd of September. The special licence was necessary because with only 9 days' leave, there was insufficient time before Guy returned to the front to call the bands. Indeed, within days, Guy was back in Passchendaele, his 3-day honeymoon locked away in his precious memory box of home. Following his departure, like many women, Elsie, already bereaved of 2 brothers, had what she termed a premonition. Suddenly, out of the cold and mist and gloom, a gleam of silver moonlight, you were there, beside me, in the little narrow room, smiling your old, glad, familiar smile, full of sweetness. With a secret fear that this was some poor shadowy wraith of you, I touched your eyes, and then we mutely kissed. Not with the fiery kisses as of old, but a sad, dumb, pitiful clinging. For a while, no word was said, until you suddenly drew yourself away from me. Your eyes grew cold, your mouth was implacable. Strangely you fled away into the cold and gloom and mist. And then I knew. A telegram arrived. Guy had been killed on the 9th of October, lost in that bitter, heaving mud. Elsie's sister's fiancé fell in the same sector weeks later. Passchendaele robbed Elsie, as it robbed so many women, of the hopes and passions of youth, of never-to-be-fulfilled motherhood, and of a life without the only man she had ever or would ever love. She believed, I shall remember, when the years have flown away and left no single visible trace of all your beauty and your body's grace, and you are one with the earth and sky and air, I shall remember how my heart grew cold beneath the sea-cold chilliness of your own, and dumb with the sick dumbness of despair. And when the last faint, shadowy evening life of life departs from me, when comes the night, and I am feeble grown, and frail, and old, I shall be taken from the haunts of men, O heart I loved, I shall remember even then. Elsie never remarried. Instead, she cherished memories of a marriage that had lasted a total of 15 days, and of which 72 hours had been spent together. This most terrible battle of 1917 conscripted her into an army in which she remained a conscripted member for the next 60 years. Mothers, as well as our wives, also joined this army. The inability to hold their child in the last agonizing moments of death haunted countless women across all combatant nations. German-born Alexandra Grantham's husband and son both perished in the service of her adopted country. Her simple words take us to the heart of a woman's grief. Finally, After 1,566 days, the war to end war finally ended. Fitting cemeteries needed to be constructed. It had already been acknowledged that the dead would live forevermore, and a way also had to be found to preserve the names and honour those whose bodies had been blown to smithereens or lost in the mud of France and Flanders, including, of course, the infamous mud of Passchendaele. Most of the missing of this battle are, like Guy Cranmer, remembered at Tyne Cot. The names of the nearly 60,000 officers and men who fell in the Ypres salient before the 16th of August 1917 and whose bodies were either never found or could not be identified are inscribed on the Menin Gate, the great memorial to the missing of the Ypres salient that was unveiled on July the 27th, 1927, in the presence of the great, the good, Belgian and British royalty, and indeed my own 12-year-old mother, whose father and Belgian godfather had served in the area. So the Menin Gate and Belgium have become part of my family as well as my national history. This gate was chosen in the Imperial War Graves Commission words because of the hundreds of thousands of men who passed through it on their way to the battlefields. The Menin Gate will be the focal point for many of the commemorations relating to Passchendaele. At 8 p.m. on the 30th of July, as they have already done nearly 31,000 times, the haunting notes of the last post will fill the evening sky. The plaintive sound will remind us of that insoluble bond forged in blood and suffering between Belgium and the men and women of the British Empire, a bond that continues to this day as the citizens of Ypres accept the nightly disruption to their city and graciously welcome modern pilgrims, as they have been doing since July 1927. Whenever I attend the Menin Gate ceremony, I think of the question posed by a young volunteer, Carola Oman. She worked in Belgium in the final months of the war and the first year of the reconstruction. She was all too familiar with Passchendaele and with wipers. In March 1919, she gazed out along the Menin Road. Over that flat, dim land, I see you moving methodically, under a dark, wide sky full of low clouds. You are gone from our loving. No fret of ours or grief can touch you now. The road speaks nothing to our longing now. Yet, I wonder, are you wholly gone? A century later, let us answer Carola and assure the dead and those who mourned them that whether they lost their life at first or second Ypres, in Gallipoli, at the Somme, in Mespot or Salonika, on the high seas, in the munitions factories, or, of course, at Passchendaele, they are not, nor will they ever be, wholly gone. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we do indeed remember them. Thank you.